Okay. And I'll mention also before we pray that it is October 11, 2014, and in Ontario here, we just finished, it's in the evening now, we just finished the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. So we are heading into the 16th day of Iphanim, the 7th Hebrew month, and it's Sunday or heading into Sunday on the Gregorian calendar. So before we get into continuing the study of the consecration of the priesthood and everything, we're going to just ask for the blessing of our Heavenly Family upon us. So Heavenly Family, just as we've been talking about, we would just thank you for everything again. And thank you for hearing our requests. And thank you for blessing us with the scriptures that you have preserved to be, maintained all the way till today. And I know that you are intending to show us a lot, Heavenly Family. And in relation to everything that's going on in all of our lives, we know that your way is in the sanctuary. And there is comfort for us there. And there is life, and there is love, and we are so far behind in understanding the sanctuary, and we, above all people, should be understanding it. And so, because of that, in one sense, we can, your rebuke to us is well taken, that we have lagged behind in study and so on. But at the same time, we take great courage from the fact that this is knowledge that you have for us that's freely available, that we don't have to wait for some future day for all of this to be unlocked, that it's here and you're asking us to search it out and to understand it, and the understanding is available. So, Sister, please guide us tonight. I know that there's so much more that I have to understand that I do not yet, concerning these different ceremonies and the rituals, both overall of the sanctuary and also for the consecration of the priesthood. So please, Sister, guide us. We want you to dominate in this conversation, and that you will reign, and just as you had inspired Ellen White to say, to let you be king. And we know now that you are truly our queen. So please rule over us as we study this and show us the truth as, you've said that you would. So we just thank you for that. And please impress it upon the hearts of all here to gain a burden to make these truths a very real thing in their own lives. Thank you so much. Father, thank you for bringing all this about. And Mother, thank you for guiding our brother through his earthly life, and also for sending your daughter to guide us through ours. Thank you. Thank you so much, Father and Mother, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So I guess we'll just quickly recap some of the things that we discussed last night, and then we'll move from there into the discussion for tonight. And, in one sense, here we are, Feast of Tabernacles, and studying things that specifically relate to the Feast of Tabernacles, but as we found, it goes so much to such a broader extent than the Feast of Tabernacles itself. And as many of you guys probably know, I think it was once every 7 years on the Feast of Tabernacles, they were to read the whole law together, the children of Israel. And so their studies, as commanded to them by our Heavenly Family, included more than just simply the Feast of Tabernacles itself and understanding that particular feast. But all these different aspects of the sanctuary service together, every component part will help us to understand every other component part. So understanding the consecration of the priesthood will help us to understand the Feast of Tabernacles, and understanding and I'll give one example as to how that works. The consecration of the priesthood contains certain sacrifices, which we're now coming to understand. And understanding those sacrifices will give us a broader understanding of the categories of sacrifices which they represent. For instance, like understanding the specific meaning of the burnt offering in the consecration of the priesthood will give us a better understanding of burnt offerings in general, and then we'll be able to more easily understand the burnt offerings to be offered during the Feast of Tabernacles. Likewise with the sin offerings and the peace offerings and all these different things. Understanding each component part will help us to understand each other component part as well as the whole. So, I won't go and discuss all the different aspects again that we went over yesterday as introductory to this topic of the consecration of the priesthood, but basically what we saw is that Feast of Tabernacles is about Yahweh tabernacling among us, and that's what the whole purpose of the sanctuary is, according to Exodus 25, verse 8. It's the whole purpose of the tabernacle that Yahweh will dwell among us. And we also learned that Yahweh can't dwell with sin, and therefore the purpose of the tabernacle must necessarily include the purification from sin, which is why when you read all the different ceremonies that were to take place in connection with the tabernacle, it's all about atonement, the removal of sin, the wiping away, and it's all culminated in that Day of Atonement. So all of this is showing, so Tabernacles has, at least as part of its meaning, a focus on the whole purpose of the sanctuary. And we learned that in order for the sanctuary services to even come into play, we first have to have the consecration of the priesthood. So you have the consecration of the priesthood, and then you have, immediately after that, the inauguration of the temple services. But if you don't have a priesthood, you have no one to actually carry out the temple services. So it's like, we need to become fully in harmony with these temple services. We need to be, as a priesthood, able to perform everything that our Heavenly Family gives us to perform. So we must be priests. And that's how we got to this whole thing from tabernacles to the consecration of the priesthood. Seeing how, before we can even be part of, in the fullest sense, keeping the Feast of Tabernacles in antitype and doing priestly activity in harmony with that, we must be able to become priests. So we were looking at Exodus 29, and I'll read the first verse again. And by the way, it's Exodus 29 and Leviticus 8. Exodus 29 gives the prescription for what they were to do in order to consecrate the priesthood. And then Leviticus chapter 8 gives the description of what they actually did. So they're very, very similar, although there are some differences in how things are put, and even certain things which are mentioned more explicitly in one than the other. But from the very first verse of Exodus 29, it says, "Now this is what you are to do for them, to consecrate them, so that they may minister as my priests." So, from the very beginning, it's saying that what it is about to describe is for them to be able to be consecrated in order that they may minister as priests. So we've seen from Zechariah chapter 3 that what we are called to today is to be a priesthood. And Zechariah 3 actually goes into it even more specifically than we've discussed so far. And then also we saw, according to Isaiah 61, that we are called to be priests. Both of those passages, if we remember everything that we've learned over the past year and a half, we've seen that Zechariah 3 and Isaiah 61 are very, very relevant and directly applicable to the present time and the present message. And when we have learned and understood that, then we can see, okay, all this talk of priesthood in those passages is a call to all who have affiliation with this message to the priesthood. In other words, if you're hearing what we're talking about right now, if you are hearing this study and you're on this conference call, or even if you're listening to this study later on YouTube or by having an MP3 file emailed to you, you are called, whether you are a man, a woman, or a child, you are called into priesthood, which means you are called to minister with and for our heavenly family. And what you are to minister is righteousness. So this is your calling, right? You're called not only to receive the righteousness of our heavenly family, but also to be able to impart it to others. And it is indeed a high calling, but all things are possible through Christ, the branch. All things are possible. And not only are all things possible, but Christ himself told us, take my yoke upon you, for my burden is light and my yoke is easy. You know, we can take this upon ourselves. And while it's true that going on this upward path, we have to sacrifice more and more. And the path becomes narrower and yet narrower. While that is true, this path is full of refreshment. You know, as you travel and, yes, go through the difficulties, there is refreshing springs of water. And as you have to sacrifice more, your load becomes lighter, and you can tread on your feet more easily. And you'll see the stains of blood on the ground before you, knowing that someone else has already walked this path. And the cord that holds you up, extended from heaven, will only become thicker and thicker. You know? Whereas going down the other path, going down the road to perdition, is full of increasingly painful thistles and thorns, and your burden becomes heavier and heavier as you load upon yourself the pile of sin and the pile of guilt. Pilgrim's Progress comes to mind. It's so the reason why I mention that is because I know that there may be the temptation for some to hear, oh, called to be priests, called to be able to impart righteousness to others. It sounds like such a heavy responsibility. And indeed it is. And indeed, the amount to which the ceremonial service engrossed the lives of the priests of old, to no less amount should it engross our lives, right? We are called to be fully immersed in this. We are called to be key players in Acts of the Apostles, Volume 2, you know? And so it is calling for entire consecration, you know? And some may, you know, kind of shrink at that thought. But know that our heavenly family has the strength, and they in fact are our strength. And so you have no need to fear the high calling, because, yeah, the higher you go, the more help you have, you know? So heaven is here to aid us. So this whole idea of the consecration of the priests and what we find here in Exodus chapter 29, the first 3 verses are summarizing for us what is to be brought. It's kind of giving a forewarning of like, okay, this is what you need to bring. This is what you need to be prepared to sacrifice in order to become priests. There's a young bull, and there's 2 rams. And then there is different grain offerings. And these grain offerings, this is one of the aspects which we need to become more intelligent in. We need to gain a better understanding of these grain offerings. I will mention, though, that Leviticus chapter 2 gives us the basic regulations for grain offerings, and that by studying Leviticus chapter 2, in connection with some of the things that we see here in Exodus 29, it will very likely give us a greater understanding. So perhaps at some point we can do that throughout the feast, whether as a group or individually. But this is what we see. Verses 1 to 3 is a summary. We have the 3 animal sacrifices, 1 young bull, and then the next one is a ram, and the next one is another ram. The first sacrifice, the young bull, is a purification offering, or it will, in some translations, read a sin offering, and it's representing the purification from sin, as we went through yesterday. The second one is a burnt offering, which is showing the keeping from sin, and the fact that now those who are represented by this burnt offering are wholly acceptable to Yahweh, a new creation. And then the third one, which is what we haven't gotten into yet, is a consecration offering or a peace offering. And one of the lessons there is that through peace, or through justification, we have peace with God, as it says in Romans chapter 5, verse 1. Particularly if you read from Romans chapter 4, verse 25, into Romans chapter 5, verse 1. The different grain offerings, as we'll see, the grain offerings are most particularly in connection with the third animal sacrifice, the one that's for the consecration or the peace offering. And they are to be placed in a basket, and they're to be taken there. And there is some significance to that, which I do not yet myself comprehend. But when we learn these things, I just want to point out that understanding these different things, understanding all the aspects of the ceremonial service, will greatly help us to understand the prophecies. Revelation is full of allusions to the sanctuary. And understanding the wilderness tabernacle and the differences and similarities between that and Solomon's temple, for instance, and the difference between those two and Ezekiel's temple. Understanding all these things will greatly understand or greatly increase our understanding of all of Scripture. And I'll give you one example of how understanding the sanctuary will help us to understand the different prophecies. One example is Zechariah chapter 5. It talks about a flying scroll. And I say, okay, what's this flying scroll about? And it says that it is 20 cubits long by 10 cubits wide. It's like, wow, that is a giant scroll. And there's many things to learn from that. One is that this scroll represents something which contains a lot of information. That's one aspect. But another is, okay, well, you have 20 cubits by 10 cubits, which is something like 30 feet by 15 feet. And that's a specific measurement that it gives. Well, in the tabernacle, you actually had in the most holy place something that was those particular measurements. And this was actually in Solomon's temple. you had 2 cherubim standing in the most holy place. And their wings, the wings from, both cherubim had their wings stretched out. And from the tip of the left wing to the tip of the right wing was 10 cubits. And the cherubim, when it stretched its wings out, the height of it went to 10 cubits high. And you had the one wing, let's just say you're looking at this from standing in the holy place.
So it was 10 cubits high and 10 cubits across.
10 cubits high and 10 cubits across for one cherubim.
Okay.
But what is described, I forget the specific passage, this is in Kings, but I'm just mentioning this as an example. If you were looking at it from the holy place, the one on the left-hand side, its right wing would touch the left wall of the most holy place, and its left wing would reach to the center of the room and would actually touch the right wing of the cherubim which is on the right. And then its left wing would touch the right wall. In other words, you have both cherubim standing there. Each of them are 10 cubits high with their wings extended, and with their wings extended, it's 10 cubits from one tip to the other of each. And each one is touching the tip of the other.
They're side by side, their wings are touching.
Their wings are touching, exactly. And so their wingspans actually took up 20 cubits lengthwise and 10 cubits widthwise or height. So there's some sort of connection there between Zechariah's prophecy of this flying scroll, and the other thing is that cherubim are flying their wings, and this scroll is flying. And we also know that wings represent truth, according to Psalm 91, verse 4. So the scroll is a scroll of truth with a lot of information, and it goes through all the earth and brings judgment. So this is one example of how, okay, if we weren't looking and studying the sanctuary service, we wouldn't know what 10 by 20 cubits means or relates to in Zechariah's prophecy. The other example is later in Zechariah 5. It talks about something being carried in a basket for measuring grain. Now, we don't understand what this prophecy is all about yet, so I'm not going to get into it. But understanding a basket for measuring grain is something that's found here in the ceremonial service. And we're reading of it in Exodus 29. So it's just to say all these different aspects will help us to understand all the prophecies. Leroy mentioned earlier Zechariah 14, and it talks about how everyone in all the nations of the earth who comes not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem during the time of the premillennial kingdom will not receive rain. And then later it talks about the bells on the horses will sound holiness to the Lord. It's like, what? Bells? That sounds kind of like high priestly language. Holiness to the Lord? That kind of sounds like high priestly language. There's something going on there where all these different prophecies are relating back to the ceremonial service. So these are very important things for us to understand. Anyway, to quickly recap the two particular sacrifices that we looked at, the very first thing, even before the sacrifice, that was to be done with Aaron and his sons, is that they were to be washed with water, a symbol of being cleansed from sin, and they were to be clothed. And the high priest in particular was to be clothed with his high priestly garments, which included more than just the linen garments. The regular priests had linen pants, which they were to wear at all times, even when washing themselves. They weren't to be totally naked, because that, again, is a symbol of self-righteousness. So they had these linen pants underneath a linen tunic. They also had a linen belt and a linen turban. So they were all in white linen, and those are the garments they wore. It was 4 garments that they wore at all times. The high priest also wore those same garments on the Day of Atonement. However, the high priest also had another particular belt that he wore. And on top of that, he had a robe, which is the robe of the ephod. It was a blue robe, on the bottom of which was a bell and a pomegranate, And basically it's telling you that the order of it was you had one bell and next to it a pomegranate, and then another bell and then a pomegranate, going all the way around. And then on top of that, he had this ephod, which was like this cloth garment which was made of different colors, which we're about to read. And on that ephod, he had a breastplate. And then also in addition to that, he had the high priestly turban, which had the diadem on it, the gold diadem engraved upon which was the phrase, "Holiness to Yahweh." So those are the priestly garments. And, hey, perhaps some point during this week, whether individually or as a group, again, and maybe we'll end up studying it next weekend, we can get more into those particular garments if the Spirit so chooses to guide us to have that as our point of emphasis. But these are the things which were placed upon Aaron, and for everyone there was the linen garments for all the priests. So these things were placed, and there's more scriptures that we did not go into yesterday, showing what that a garment symbolizes righteousness. And there's even a place in Job 29 verse 14 talks about how he says, my judgment was a robe and a turban. It says, I put on my clothing was righteousness, and my robe and my turban was judgment. And so there's different places to other scriptures which help us to understand what these different things represent. Also, Isaiah 11, just understanding on what it means to have it be judgment, is judging not. It talks about the one whose name is Branch, and he shall judge not according to the sight of his eyes nor the hearing of his ears, but according to the Spirit, and he shall judge righteous judgment. The turban shows that ability, being able to judge righteous judgment. But these are all these different symbols. So first we have the removal of sin and the putting on of the righteousness of Christ, symbolized by the garments. And then to further illustrate this purification of sin, the first offering is the purification offering, which is a bull. And I'm sure there is more significance as to the difference between sacrificing a bull versus a ram versus a goat versus a sheep. And there's all these different animals that were used. But one of the aspects is that after the first sacrifice of the bull, and you went to the next sacrifice represented the same people, yet it was less lofty. The bull is more lofty than the ram, showing that there was a humbling, there was a humiliation process or a humbling process or experience through which they had passed. So they would no longer be represented by the loftier animal, but by the more humble animal. Now, The first one, again, we saw that some of its blood was put on the four horns of the altar, and then the rest was poured out at the base of the altar. We saw that only part of it was to be offered up on the altar of burnt offering, and the rest of it was taken and burned outside the camp. And it was showing that this was not wholly acceptable, but yet there was something that was there in this animal that could be offered up to Yahweh. And that is the fact that our Heavenly Family has created each individual person with so much potential and with something about them that can be used for the work and can be offered to Yahweh. You know, their ability to digest the truth, their unique perspective, their contribution to the whole community. But the symbols of sin, in particular the flesh, the skin representing self-righteousness, and the dung representing the product of the carnal mind, all these things must be utterly disregarded. So following that, there's the next sacrifice, which is the whole burnt offering. And what it represented was now those who would be purified from sin in the consecration of themselves as becoming priests would now be a new creature. And therefore it's fitting for them to be represented by a new animal, this time humbled from the loftier animal. And this time, an animal which is wholly acceptable. So this time, its blood was to be splashed all around the altar, or splashed on the sides of the altar. And as we spoke of, the altar represents Israel, the 12 tribes, showing that now this animal, its life, its blood, is to be spread throughout all Israel. It is to be placed upon all the tribes. In other words, now this new creature, their life, which is now the life of Christ, is to be spread to everyone else. They're to impart that life to others. And this ram was to be cut in pieces, and its entrails were to be washed, and its legs were to be washed, showing that the way that these priests would now walk, their legs, would be clean, would be cleansed, would be washed, and that their entrails, their innards, their inner working, how they work. And by the way, the innards was viewed as not only the seat of emotion, but the seat of thought. So when we talk about how the entrails represent the way of thinking and so on, this back in the ancient Hebrew culture, they did not understand that we think with our brain. They attributed the seat of thought and emotion to things like the liver and the kidneys and the entrails, the innards. So that's why some of these things became particular symbols in the ceremonial service. And actually going and understanding more of how these particular things represented the different aspects, as in the difference between kidneys and liver, will help us to understand why these different parts of the animals were taken. And actually, let me just see if I can pull up a quick thing on that issue. might not be able to find it as quickly as I would like, but at some point we can make that a point of study to go through different places in the scriptures that speak of kidneys and liver and so on as the seat of emotion and thought and all these other things. So, continuing on with the ritual itself, these things were to be washed, showing that they are made clean, and then they are to be placed upon the pieces and on its head of this ram, and the whole ram was to be burnt on the altar. It was wholly acceptable to Yahweh. It is a burnt offering, a soothing aroma, and the reason why it's saying that it's a soothing aroma is because, again, this whole thing is pleasing to Yahweh. Now it represents something which Yahweh looks and can smile. It is an offering made by fire, being wholly consumed by fire is a symbol of being wholly consumed by the Spirit. Now the next offering, this is in verse 19 of Exodus 29. This is, I'll actually just start reading it. It says, you are to take, and this is still speaking to Moses, you are to take the second ram, and Aaron and his sons are to lay their hands on the ram's head. Again, showing that the lamb was to symbolize them. And you are to, or to represent them. And this, by the way, I'll just, as a quick side note, this is where the practice of laying on of hands largely comes from in the New Testament, where they were to lay their hands on someone, and typically we would call that ordination. It was to set them aside as specifically being representatives of the whole community. They were being set apart by the laying on of hands. So laying on of hands is showing now this person or this animal represents me or represents us. So you are to, this is verse 20, and you are to kill the ram and take some of its blood and put it on the tip of the right ear of Aaron and on the tip of the right ear of his son, on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of their right foot. And then splash the blood all around on the altar. So here we have something different being done. And actually, I think I'll read to the end of verse 22 first to show how it's a consecration offering, and then we'll come back to this point. It says, verse 21, you are to take some of the blood that is on the altar and some of the anointing oil and sprinkle it on Aaron, on his garments, on his sons, and on his sons' garments with him, so that he may be holy, he and his garments, along with his sons and his sons' garments. And by the way, that verse, I read it because it's in most translations, but it's in the Masoretic text, but it is not in the Dead Sea Scrolls nor in the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritan Pentateuch, along with the Dead Sea Scrolls, those are the two most ancient versions of the 5 books of Moses that we have. And this verse doesn't show up in any of them. So I'm going to read verse 22 now. You are to take from the ram the fat tail, the fat that covers the entrails, the lobe of the liver, the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them, and the right thigh. For it is the ram for consecration. Ram for consecration, or some translations say ordination. This particular sacrifice is to symbolize, in antitype, what it is that now makes the priests particularly ready for work as priests. And it goes on describing what takes place with the cakes. Now, this one is the one that is least understood so far to this point. So we should be studying it and trying to understand it better and better. And Heavenly Family, please do help us to understand it better and better. But first, it describes all that, what we just read, and it says, "For it is the ram for consecration." So we know that these different aspects are showing the consecration of the priest. So first you have the blood, and is put on the tip of the right ear of Aaron and his sons, and then put on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of their right foot. The right side in general represents strength. And also, in this ritual, actually, no, I'm going to skip this part for now. I'll just mention the idea of the right being strength, and then the idea of the ear, the thumb, and the big toe of the foot represent basically the consecration of the hearing, the consecration of the doing, and the consecration of the walking. So all the different aspects of what Aaron and the priests were to hear, everything that they were to do, and everywhere where they were to go, was to all exemplify the shed blood of Christ, and also was to be everything that they were to live for themselves. In other words, this ram, again, they were to lay their hands on it, showing that it represented them, and their life was to be devoted. Well, I guess another way that I could put it is this. From this point on, everything that they were to hear, do, and wherever they would go would be devoted to life rather than death or anything associated with it. So that basically sums up that symbol, although I'm sure there's more to it as to why, instead of just the entirety of the right foot, why specifically the big toe? Why specifically the thumb? Why specifically the tip of the ear, rather than saying put it on the right ear, the right hand, and the right foot? You know, it's more specific, and these are things that we have yet to understand. So let's actually dive in, searching the scriptures, trying to understand it, rather than waiting for the understanding to just simply come to us. And then there's the aspects beyond that of the rest of the blood going on the altar, which we already covered what that means in the previous sacrifice. But that verse, again, verse 21, does not appear in the text. And then taking the fat of the ram, the tail fat, or the fat tail, and the fat that covers the entrails, the lobe and 2 kidneys, those things we'll have to understand better when we understand more specifically the difference in the symbolism between, for example, the liver and the kidneys and entrails overall, and what does it mean to have, you know, the fat that covers them. You know, we're told to, in Isaiah 55, to delight ourselves in fatness, you know, and some of these things, I'll just mention one of the symbols of fatness has to do with truth, and so the truth related to each one of these component parts is being offered. But we don't know what that specifically means in each aspect, just the overall view. And then you're to take verse 23, the one round flat cake of bread, one perforated cake of oiled bread, which perforated means it has holes poked in it, like kind of like if you were to do a flat bread and take a fork and poke it all over, that would be perforated. So one round flat cake of bread, one perforated cake of oiled bread, and one wafer from the basket of bread made without yeast, that is before Yahweh. You are to put all these in Aaron's hands and in his son's hands, and you are to wave them as a wave offering before Yahweh. Then you are to take them from their hands and burn them on the altar, burn them on the altar for a burnt offering, for a soothing aroma before Yahweh. It is an offering made by fire to Yahweh. You are to take the breast of the ram of Aaron's consecration. You are to wave it as a wave offering before Yahweh, and it is to be your share. You are to sanctify the breast of the wave offering and the thigh of the contribution, which were waved and lifted up as a contribution for the ram of consecration, for what belongs to Aaron, from what belongs to Aaron and to his sons. It is to belong to Aaron and to his sons from the Israelites by a perpetual ordinance, for it is a contribution. It is to be a contribution from the Israelites from their peace offerings, their contribution to Yahweh. And basically what that's saying is that this consecration offering is a peace offering, and that for every peace offering, they were only to offer up a memorial portion that they were actually to burn on the altar. The rest of it, the priests, were to eat, whether it was grain or whether it was part of the animal. They were to eat it. And I believe, whether it's in this chapter or Leviticus 8, there was part of this that was actually to be for Moses, because he was acting in this instance as priest. So like we said, these different aspects of the grain offering, as we continue on to study this week, let's make it a point to study Leviticus chapter 2, where it goes through the different regulations for the grain offerings. And hopefully that'll help us to represent or to understand what these different aspects represent. I know that some of it is, being able to be seen to some extent through a glass darkly, as Paul said, but definitely not shining out in the brightness which it hopefully soon will. But these things, again, like we talked about earlier, are not hidden mysteries which we are not to understand. These things are laid before us for our study and for our investigation. So let us study it out and find out really what it means. The rest of the chapter, we probably won't go on for much longer, because we've already been on for over an hour here. But the rest of it basically talks about, we will read it and have some comment. Starting at verse 31, it says, "You are to take the ram of the consecration and cook its meat in the holy place. Aaron and his sons are to eat the meat of the ram and the bread that was in the basket at the entrance of the tent of meetings," that's in the courtyard. And so you see here that they were to take a piece of each of the different types of bread from the basket and offer that as part of the burnt offering, but the rest they were to leave in the basket, and that was to be for Aaron and his sons, as well as the portions of the peace offering that weren't wholly burnt. They are to eat those things by which atonement was made, to consecrate and to set them apart, but no one else may eat them, for they are holy. If any of the meat from the consecration offerings or any of the bread is left over until morning, then you are to burn up what is left over. It must not be eaten, because it is holy. Thus you are to do for Aaron and for his sons, according to all that I have commanded you. You are to consecrate them for 7 days. Every day, and this is the next key part, every day you are to prepare a bull for a purification offering for atonement. Now, at this point, someone may look at that and say, oh, why are they now having to do more purification offerings? I thought they were already pure. Is this intending to teach the message that even though they were purified, even though they were justified, they would still be living in sin? And the answer to that is no, because now this purification offering is not for them. It is actually for the altar, which is what it says in the next sentence. It says, you are to purge the altar by making atonement for it, and you are to anoint it to set it apart as holy. Now, there's multiple reasons for that. One is that the altar had taken on the sin of the priesthood, and it needed to be purged so that as the ceremonial service would continue on in its typical setting, the altar would be able to take on the sin from all the different sacrifices. That's one aspect. The other aspect will be understood more and more as we understand what the altar itself represents. However, we know that one aspect is that it represents Israel. So this is talking about how the priests, for a complete period of time, 7 days, were now to offer sin offerings for Israel. During these 7 days, which is the time in which they are really learning to become priests. So as they are learning to become priests, they are offering sin offerings for the altar for Israel, which is teaching the lesson that as people are becoming priests here in our day, they are to be offering sin offerings, which is, again, purification of Israel, purification of the church, purification of the people, which our part in doing that can only be to share the truth to them so that they may, if they are willing, become sin offerings themselves. So here at this point, they are becoming priests, and they are able to offer the sin offering just like Moses offered the sin offering for them. So Moses offered the sin offering for them, which represented them. Likewise, the priesthood would offer, or the sons of Aaron would offer sin offerings for the people, which would represent the people. And here the people are symbolized by the altar, the symbol of Israel. So they were to do that for 7 days. Verse 37, for 7 days you are to make atonement for the altar and to set it apart as holy. Then the altar will be most holy. Anything that touches the altar will be holy. Now this is what you are to prepare on the altar every day continually. And this is actually where it goes, and it's done talking about the consecration of the priests for this part here. It's now talking about the daily burnt offering. So this is showing, okay, starting now, you're supposed to do this daily burnt offering. So this was to be done even included in the 7 days. In the NET, it actually mistranslates a part in verse 41. It says the second lamb you are to offer around sundown. That's not actually an accurate translation. In Hebrew, it is specifically to be offered between the evenings. It was to be slain at the 9th hour and offered up on the altar immediately following that, which was between the one evening and the other. The one evening is the 9th hour, the other evening is sunset. And we can get into these aspects at another time to show how we know what the 2 evenings are and so on and so forth. But basically that kind of sums up this aspect. The other thing that I want to mention in regard to the 7 days At the end of those 7 days is when the priests were done their consecration. It took 7 days for them to be fully consecrated, to be able to minister in the affairs of the people. Now, some of you may remember Doug talking about days as representing periods of light in the context of light being revelation of truth. In this context, we have 7 days or 7 periods of light. And these 7 periods of light show 7 times of revelation of truth. And this light would shine to the priests as they're there in the courtyard of the sanctuary for those 7 days. So it is this light which would lighten all the things in the courtyard for them. So they would be there. This is the 7 days. They're now in the courtyard for 7 days, being initiated into their priesthood. And so they are learning everything in the tabernacle. And they are learning it in the light of these 7 days. These 7 days being in antitype, the messages of the 7 angels, the sevenfold revelation of truth. So we are to learn, and as we've seen in our studies, these 7 angels' messages of Revelation 14 are revealing the gospel. So we are to learn the ceremonial service in light of the gospel, in light of the 7 angels' messages. These messages are to shed light upon the sanctuary and its services. And this is to be done as we are entering the school of Christ. We are to learn these things, and we are to be doing this in preparation to being priests ready and able to perform everything that our Heavenly Family commands. So that's probably a good place to close for this subject. And yeah, there's definitely a lot more here that we have learned that we did not know before, and there's still a lot to learn. So as it has always been, as we learn these different aspects, we should go and take it and study it so that we can come together again, and each person can bring forward any different element that they have learned, any connections that they've seen throughout the scriptures, and we can come and study, and we can see what our Heavenly Family shows us. But are there any thoughts on this so far? Thoughts or comments, questions, anything like that?
Well, it sure seems as though we're getting our job description. And it sure seems as though, I feel like that I've been called back for the second interview. And now, it's time to make up my mind.
Amen. Yeah, it's really, like you said, we're getting the job description clearly laid out for us, right? And how we are to enter into this. And something that I'll mention too, that we can be rest assured of, is that the different elements of this which are not yet revealed, specifically in relation to the third sacrifice and the bread offerings that go along with it. If everyone here was to place themselves as a living sacrifice for the first two, in other words, if you let those first two sacrifices be fulfilled in you, if everyone who's on this meeting was to do that, then our Heavenly Family would without a doubt show us in specific detail what the third sacrifice means. Because that's what we would need to know right at that moment. Right now, I think that the reason why they've only given us a glimmering of it and not shown it in its fullness is to emphasize the necessity for the first two prior to the third. Because it's not just about understanding these things as a theory. It's about living it as a reality.
So true.
But yeah, I appreciate that comment, Carol. Any other comments or questions? Perhaps not. All right, well, we'll close off with prayer, and if anyone has any other thoughts that come to your mind between now and when we close, feel free to mention it. But for now, we'll just pray and thank our Heavenly Family. Thank you so much, Heavenly Family, for guiding us and pointing us to really what we need to understand now and what we need to know where you are guiding us. I mean, it's really incredible, sister, to think of how, you're really on the move. You have shown something over this past year and a half, and you have been trying to gather up this people as an army, and you've been showing these different aspects, and now you're here saying, to emphasize even more the need of purification from sin, and showing us in these types and symbols, showing us the reality to which they point, and calling us to experience it. So, Heavenly Family, please raise this people up as a nation of kings and priests. Thank you so much. Thank you for revealing these things, and thank you. I know that you aren't doing these things in vain, and you've said that your word will not return unto you void, but it will accomplish the thing whereunto you sent it. And so, Heavenly Family, please show each one here how to have their hearts be receptive to this truth and to work in them, to allow you to do in them what they can't do for themselves. Thank you, Heavenly Family. Give us a revelation of your love as never before. Thank you. In the name of Brad, she and she. Amen.
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 And I did notice, Walter sent a text saying first purification and dedication. I'm assuming, and then dedication. Yeah, the order is first purification, and then, first the purification offering, which shows being purified from sin, and then the whole burnt offering, which is the new creation, which is wholly acceptable. That's the new man, right? Someone who is now being justified. And then the third sacrifice is showing the equipping of the person to be able to minister, consecrating them as a priest in particular. The peace offerings were in a special way for the priests. They were to eat of it and all these other aspects. Did someone else have something that they wanted to say? I suppose not. All right, well, may our Heavenly Family be with you all, and love you guys very much. And actually, you know what? Let's see here. Maybe I'll mention one other thing. Yeah, I guess everyone here is now past the Sabbath. The Sabbath is over for everyone, I'm pretty sure.
What time is it?
Other than, it's 9:30 almost here.
Probably not in BC.
Okay, in BC. Are you guys still in the Sabbath in BC?
Or Washington or wherever.
Or Washington?
Yes.
The sound of sometimes.
Very close.
Very close. Okay, yes, still in Sabbath. Okay. What I was going to do is just let you guys all know kind of an update on things here with the search for land and the rest of that. But I'll not do that now. We can update you guys through email and as things go, and as things go, we'll keep you guys informed. But our Heavenly Family is definitely guiding, and I do want to mention just generally, keep this whole circumstance in prayer, because it affects us all more than we realize. You know, I know that it may be easy just going through life and not really having it come to your mind too often, all the things that are taking place with the work, but our Heavenly Family is guiding, and they are bringing us to a situation that will be better than we could have really thought initially. So keep it in prayer. Teresa and I definitely need wisdom as we are going through and, you know, doing these different aspects of the search. All right, so love you guys and have a good night, and hope that you have a wonderful Feast of Tabernacles.
Love you guys. Night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Good night, Teresa and Trent.
Good night.